Inspired by the life of the savvy and ambitious Colombian businesswoman Griselda Blanco comes a new Netflix original limited series. Griselda tells the story of a devoted mother who, with her lethal blend of charm and relentless savagery, creates one of the most powerful cartels in history. Witness Sofia Vergara's captivating transformation into the godmother of the underworld. Griselda, now streaming only on Netflix.
This episode is brought to you by Bumble, who says Valentine's Day is just for couples. Just because you're not in a relationship doesn't mean you can't get out there and live your best love life. That's where Bumble comes in. This February 14th, you can flip the script and give those relationshipers a friendly dose of FOMO. Say no to staying in this Valentine's Day and yes to more. More dates, more first kisses, more gossip for the group chat girlies. Do Valentine's your way. Date now on Bumble.
Each week on the One Hit Thunder podcast, we welcome a special guest to come take a deep dive into a one-hit wonder artist with us. And together, we decide if that artist brought the one-hit thunder or was nothing more than a one-hit blunder. You can find One Hit Thunder anywhere that you listen to podcasts, so hit that subscribe button and join in on the fun each week.
We're here to entertain you. We'll sing your songs for good times, the best times. You can't go wrong. We'll two-step, a new step. It won't be long. When the Dixielanders are playing, soon you'll be swaying. So come on, sing along.
Hello, all you fun and lovely people out there, and welcome to another episode of Before My Time. I'm your host, Kelsey Laurie, where we are talking about things we love that happened, well, before our time. Today we are joined by, well, we're always joined by our lovely friend and producer, Matt Kelly, but he is here to talk about Doug Kinney, and I can't wait. Let's go.
Well, what the hell was supposed to do, you?
All right, Matt, I am ready to learn all about Doug Kinney.
I had been wanting us to talk about Doug Kinney actually right before we did the SNL episode. And then as we were recording the SNL episode, I was like, no, we have to do Doug Kinney. And then I just happened to reread a book that I forgot was like sort of like an almost semi-biography about him. And I'm like, all right, all this information's fresh in my head. Just finished this book like a week ago. Let's just dive in. Let's record it.
Let's go now.
All right.
You got it.
Tell me everything you know about Doug Kinney first.
He's part of National Lampoon. That's all I've got. Like,
Okay.
Literally, I know nothing.
Okay. So Doug Kinney, and I'll say that the two sources that I have for this is source number one is a book called A Cinderella Story, The Making of Caddyshack. And the other source is a Netflix biopic starring Will Forte called A Futile and Stupid Gesture.
Ooh.
Those are like the two Doug Kinney stories. There's also a book by the exact same name, A Futile and Stupid Gesture, that is the official biography. It's very expensive right now because it's out of print. So I haven't had a chance to grab that. So Doug Kinney got his start in Harvard, writing for the Harvard Lampoon with his friend Harry Beard. The Harvard Lampoon's been around for hundreds of years. Like that is like...
Oh, the Harvard Lampoon. Yeah.
Yeah, it was like the humor magazine of Harvard. That's where like all the high intelligent writers, a lot of Simpsons writers wrote for the Harvard Lampoon at one point. It's just considered like a very like abstract humor.
But they're all brilliant.
But it was only distributed in Harvard. It was just like the same as you would get like at your college, you get your college newspaper, like you could get this magazine while you were at Harvard. Doug Kinney spearheaded this idea that they were going to do an issue that was a parody of Playboy. And he was like, we should not only do this, but we should try to get it on actual magazine racks. And it caused this huge controversy where Hugh Hefner originally tried to sue them for them using his creative property, but then found the magazine actually really, really funny and was like, okay, you're good to go. But that was kind of when they got the spark of like, ooh, we could take what we're doing in Harvard and blow it out on a national scale. Hence the National Lampoon. He cashed out in a huge way with this because it was such a high stakes deal, and no one really thought that it was going to work because there wasn't a huge market for humor magazines. I forget the way it worked, but they basically signed a contract that, like, if their starting pay was like $10,000 for the year, at the end of 5 years, they could cash out for that 10,000 times however big the product had grown up to that time, and almost bankrupt the magazine because the magazine was so successful that the person who signed the original contract didn't have enough money to pay them.
Wow.
He was kind of one of the people behind the infamous, it's arguably one of the most famous magazine covers of all time, which is a dog with a gun at its head. And the dog looks terrified and it says, if you don't buy this magazine, we will kill this dog.
I mean, they were like, we're going to go for the sales tactic.
Yeah. Like, and that was like issue like 10. You know what I mean? Like, it was like early on, they're like, this is what our show is. So they're doing this National Lampoon thing. From the start, Doug Kinney was the wild card. So you had these friends who were putting this thing together, but Doug would just disappear for months on end and go on a drug binge into nowhere, or decide to write the great American novel and would come back with like a 300, like he wanted to write this book called like Teenage Commies from Outer Space or something like that. And it was like this crazy counterculture parody, but tied into like a 50s sci-fi aesthetic, but with like hippies instead of aliens type thing. And reportedly, he just went missing, didn't say goodbye to anybody, just packed his bags, left for like 6 months to live on a vineyard and write this book, and came back and gave it to his friend Beard and was like, hey, tell me if this is any good. And Beard was like, it sucks. And he goes, I know it does. And he just threw it in the trash and was like, let's start working on the magazine. Like, just completely like seemed like the most difficult human being to work with. Because he left the magazine, he was kind of blackballed by the magazine when he came back. They didn't want him working on the magazine because they didn't feel like they could trust him because he just upped and left. So they're like, go find something else to do under the National Lampoon name. So he started doing college tours, and he would appear at colleges and he would talk about the magazine. And while doing that, he would hit up all the different improv and comedy scenes. And one particular day he was in Chicago, and that's when he met John Belushi, Harold Ramis, a bunch of the Second City team, essentially, and said, y'all have to come to New York. We're going to figure out something. And just on a whim, John Belushi, Bill Murray, Chevy Chase, and I believe it was Harold Ramis all jumped in a van and moved to New York with no job lined up. And he was like, we're going to start a radio show. And they started the National Lampoon Radio Hour, where they would do these improvised hour-long comedy shows on the radio. The popularity of that turned into, let's do a Woodstock parody, and they called it Lemmings. And it was like Woodstock gone wrong. And that's where John Belushi first did his John Cocker impersonation. That's like, they basically just had all of these Lampoon characters. That's when Gilda Radner came in. Like, when they were trying to do Saturday Night Live, they came to National Lampoon first. And the guy who I talked about earlier, who couldn't pay them out, didn't think it was a good idea and never passed the idea to them. Now, Lauren Michaels...
he's kicking himself.
Lauren Michaels was a huge fan of the Lemmings show in New York and would go and see it on a regular basis. And that's when he decided to pitch his comedy show to NBC instead, knowing that they were looking for something. And he used Lemmings as his, like, this is the type of thing we want to do. And then auditioned a bunch of those performers and basically got all of them, got almost all of them to be on his show, and took most of the writing staff from National Lampoon to write that first season as well, which put Doug in a deep depression. Now, ready to cash out officially, the guy, still not having money, made a desperate plea, and he said, you can't leave now. We're about to produce our first movie, which he had no plans of, but he figured it would keep them.
Didn't exist.
Yeah, it didn't exist. So he told Doug Kinney that him and his friend Harold could write a movie together. And they wrote Animal House. And they said, his exact quote was, if Lauren Michaels is going to beat us to having the National Lampoon's TV series, we're going to beat him to a National Lampoon movie. The original design of the National Lampoon movie John Belushi was basically the only character that they got in the movie with the actor that they wanted for the role. The role of Otter, they wanted Chevy Chase for. The role of D-Day, they wanted Dan Aykroyd for. Like, they wanted that core group.
They wanted their original radio cast.
Yes, they wanted it to be this reunion. Obviously, contracts and money become a thing, but they make this Animal House movie. No one believes in it. No one thinks that it's going to work. The biggest thing that you need to know about the Animal House movie is that Harold Ramis was told he would be allowed to direct the film. And then at the last second, they're like, we can't hire someone who's never directed anything in his life. We're going to hire this John Landis kid instead. Harold Ramis took great offense.
And went off and had his own revenge career.
Well, he left. He was just like, I'm not going to be a part of this. And he disappears and he goes back to Lampoon to work on the magazine some more. The other two, Doug Kinney and the other writer who, like, the Animal House movie is based on an article that was in the National Lampoon about this one guy's experience at frats, because frats weren't like a super prevalent thing at Harvard, really, like not on that scale. So like Doug Kinney was just like obsessed with this concept of like these out of control, like
parties
drunk party animals. So he like was all about being on the set and experiencing that, since he didn't have that as part of his college experience. So he actually has a role in the movie. He appears in the movie. He is the character who guides the marching band into an alley in the middle of nowhere.
Oh, okay, yeah.
He has a couple lines in the movie. He's like, what are you, some kind of moron? Like, he says that line. He's got a couple key lines in the movie, but an actor he was not. The biggest thing, though, was adding John Landis to the craziness was that John Landis kept everything on track. He, you know, he knew the right amount of things to film, and he really made sure that they stuck to the script. National Lampoon's Animal House becomes a fucking sensation. Like, it is an explosion, this nuclear explosion of comedy. No one's ever seen it before. They think that this is like the game changer, right? And I've talked about this a little bit because I said like there was MASH was like kind of opening the door to this kind of movie, but like you look at comedies up until Animal House and comedies after Animal House, and it is literally changes what you can do in a comedy, and for better or for worse. You know, like some of the stuff doesn't age well, but like it was a very dramatic, we are sick and tired of just like the screwball comedy, witty, charismatic, everybody's a good guy type movie, and we want to make movies where everyone's a villain. Even the people you're cheering for are kind of villains. So just earth-shattering concepts that they come up with for this. So now, all of a sudden, Doug Kinney, Harold Ramis, John Landis, all of these guys are a hot commodity. Everybody wants a piece of them. So Harold Ramis and Doug Kinney are like, let's do another movie. Let's make sure now we're in a power position. We'll say that we'll walk unless you get to direct it, Harold. Like, they're like, this is going to be your movie. So they start shopping around. They end up with Orion Pictures, a brand new studio who wants to produce their next movie. They don't care what it is. So they bring in their friends, Bill and Brian Doyle Murray, to help them work on this script, because the Murray brothers are two, like Brian Doyle and Bill are two of, I believe, 9 children. The Murray family is massive. What you may not know is that in the summers when they were teenagers, all of the Murray kids made a living as caddies at the local country club. So Brian Doyle Murray had all of these stories about like what it's like being like this poor kid who carries the bag for the rich, eccentric person, and how weird some of these eccentric people were that spent all their time at country clubs. So they start putting all of this into a script, and they write Caddyshack. And apparently the original script was like 350 something pages. It was this massive Bible of a script. Simultaneously, John Landis and John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd go off to make the Blues Brothers. And now it's seen as this competitive, like, who's going to rise above as who are we following as the success of Animal House? Was it the guys who wrote it, or was the star and the director? Like, so there's this kind of playful but not so playful battle between these two different teams. They have to do everything in their power to get the actors that they want for these roles, because Orion's like getting really nervous that there's a lot of inexperience. And apparently every time that they went into the writer's room, it was just clouds of weed and piles of cocaine. But they're like, no, we can get Bill Murray, we can get Harold Ramis, we can get Ted Knight, and we want to get Rodney Dangerfield. And Orion's like, if you can nail all of those names down, we will leave you alone. Which probably was the biggest mistake of Orion's career. Because what ended up happening is Harold Ramis, being an inexperienced director, decided, I've done improv my entire life. I'm sure that we can just improvise this movie and it'll cut together and make sense. So they kind of threw away the script for most of the filming and would just say, like, all right, in this scene, Chevy, you give him a speech. And then they would just hit record and let Chevy just ramble for 2 hours and then feel like, okay, we'll get something out of that. That was the vibe for about 2 weeks. The book describes the filming of Caddyshack as like the most insane situation.
This episode is brought to you by Bumble, who says Valentine's Day is just for couples. Just because you're not in a relationship doesn't mean you can't get out there and live your best love life. That's where Bumble comes in. This February 14th, you can flip the script and give those relationshippers a friendly dose of FOMO. Say no to staying in this Valentine's Day and yes to more. More dates, more first kisses, more gossip for the group chat girlies. Do Valentine's your way. Date now on Bumble.
And they said that there's really no acting in that movie that you're seeing. Like even Ted Knight was like this classically trained actor. He went to bed at 8 p.m. every night, was awake at 5 a.m. every morning, had his own like private hotel because he didn't want to stay. Everyone else rented rooms at the club where they were filming everything. So it was like they were on set 24/7, just getting partying crazy. But Ted Knight was like a follow the script type person. So when you watch that movie, him angrier and angrier is also
very real.
It's very real because he has no improv background. So people are like making up stuff on the
He's like,
spot.
this isn't in the book. I go by the script. Yeah.
Like apparently there's a scene that I always remembered loving that they talk about in the book. And if you remember, there's a scene where Smales and another character are having a conversation, and in the background is one of the golfer's nephews, and he's just trying to hit a golf ball and he keeps missing it, and he's yelling like turds, double turds, like as he's missing the ball. Apparently Harold Ramis pulled him aside and was like, hey, this scene's kind of boring comedically. It's just like a dialogue scene. So pretend that you're trying to hit the golf ball and just start yelling nonsense every time that you miss the ball. And this is like a 19-year-old kid. He's like, all right. So he goes and he does the scene, but Harold Ramis admits, like, I knew that it would piss off Ted, and that
that would only like make it better, just that like authentic fuel to the fire.
And the kid said that Ted Knight, after they were done filming, pulled him aside and was like, look, I know you're new here, but it's not appropriate to to try to pull the spotlight off of the actual actors. He thought it was just an extra, like going into business for himself.
It's like the director told me.
So like complete pandemonium. Doug Kinney decides that he wants to be a producer when they make this movie. He's like, I co-wrote it, but like, Harold's the director, Brian Doyle Murray's acting in it. Bill Murray's acting in it. I don't want to be an actor. I'm going to be a producer. That seems to be where the business is at. And that's when he quickly learned that being a producer is fucking boring when you're actually on set. Like you're basically just in charge of making sure that stuff runs on time. And Caddyshack was absolutely never going to be running on time. So he would just spend all of his time getting high in his bedroom with whatever person wasn't filming at that time and started to fall into a depression. So the movie comes out, and the movie originally is 3 hours long. They tried so hard to keep in every funny bit because they were also editing it themselves that finally Orion Pictures is like, we need to bring in literally anybody else to edit this movie. So here comes when you're like a super creative minded person. This is where I kind of relate to Doug Kinney. Doug Kinney is experiencing true failure for the first time in his mind. You know what I mean? Like he starts the National Lampoon. It's a huge success. He writes, he does a Broadway show. It blows up. He does a radio hour. They basically steal his idea and turn it into a TV show. Like he makes a movie. It's the biggest movie of all time. And now he's having something that he worked on being pulled away from him because it's so bad. the dancing gopher was never in the original movie. That was a thing that they shot afterwards with a second crew to try to piece the movie together with like some through line because it was so disconnected. So Doug Kinney didn't get to see the final product of the movie until the press screening. So he's sitting in the back. He's seeing that this isn't the movie that he made anymore. And he can tell that the audience is not loving it. The way it was reported was like there were chuckles, but there wasn't any like huge belly
wasn't
laughs.
The Animal House response.
It wasn't the Animal House response. People weren't losing their minds. So Doug Kinney gets drunk and very stoned and stumbles into the morning press junket. And as soon as they start the junket, starts to heckle everybody involved in Caddyshack from the back, yelling about how awful the movie is, how disappointing it is, how the press should have plenty of fodder to make sure that no one sees the movie, like has a full public breakdown in front of the people who are trying to save the movie.
Oh no.
And it's decided, Doug, you need to go away. Their solution is to take his best friend and drug buddy, Chevy Chase, and have him take him to an island for him to detox. Apparently no detoxing happened.
Look, that's exactly what they did, right?
Yeah, during that trip. Chevy Chase had to go back home to film a movie. Doug said he was going to stay for another day or two and then catch up with him. And then no one hears from Doug for a little bit. And people are like, oh no, what happened? They show up to his hotel room. It's a complete mess, but it's got all these different notes and like ideas for future movies, ideas for books. And there was a note that he left that I don't know why the sentiment of this note always hits me so hard, but it's something that I feel like I can relate to in a weird way, is that there was just a single note that said, these have been some of the best days I've ever ignored. I think really encapsulates the sense of humor of Doug Kinney and like the weirdness of like how he saw the world and like what he considered funny and what he considered interesting. So they go and they find, he went for a hike. And there was a hike trail that was like, hey, no one past this point. Doug Kinney always would accept a challenge. So he went up to that hill.
Nothing went past this point, yeah.
He went past that point, and they found a pair of sneakers and some glasses, and then at the bottom of the cliff, his body. It was ruled as an accidental death. His friends debated if it was suicide or if he actually was just high and fell. Harold Ramis specifically said, knowing Doug, he fell trying to find a place to jump. Which is which is such a...
I think you've said that before. I think I've heard that. Yeah.
Great line. Like that's when you know that you've left your impact as a comedian on your friends, that they'll make jokes like that. He was kind of the first. A lot of people say like John Belushi was the first casualty of that comedy scene, but it really was Doug. Doug died first. People have kind of said it's a shame because, now Caddyshack is regarded as a masterpiece. I actually think Caddyshack is a better movie than Animal House, personally.
I think Animal House just got the notoriety because, like you said, it was the first one. It was a trailblazer.
It was the first one.
That's the first always kind of gets that like higher recognition, but isn't always necessarily the best.
Exactly. And it's one of those stories where it's like, I am always kind of inspired by Doug Kinney's story of like just leaning into the weird and being weird. But like, it also, it breaks your heart because it's like, here's this brilliant comedic mind. And especially at that time, when you look at the late 70s, early 80s, such a dangerous time to be in comedy. Because it's just drugs are absolutely flowing everywhere. And it's kind of celebrated to be broken. It makes me excited that like modern day, I always talk about how modern day wrestling and modern day comedy are on the same path right now, where it's like, no, it's like cool to be sober. It's cool to be seeing a therapist. It's cool to be like taking care of your body and eating healthy. Like,
yeah, it's like our health as a society is more of a higher concern, be it physical health and mental health is such a huge, I hate to call it it's a fad. It's a great fad, but it's really in, but it's good. It's like we care. And so normally it's stereotypical for comedians to come from a depressed point of view. And that's kind of where, as I've told you many times, it's like comedy's my coping mechanism. So sometimes when I'm like the lowest, I'll come out with the funniest.
Yeah.
I'm like, but there was no way to handle it then, except like I said, there's just so many accessibilities to drugs.
Yeah.
And that is a great way to, combat depression.
And it being celebrated. Like, I talked about this on a different podcast, but like, I think of, say, like John Candy. You know what I mean? Like when John Candy died, not that John Candy was ever big on the drug scene. He was just a heavy, like he smoked his cigars and drank his booze, but he wasn't doing the cocaine or anything like that. But like John Hughes walked away from Hollywood entirely after John Candy died because he felt like he couldn't support a machine that put their profits above John Candy getting help. So like, they wanted him to be the 400-pound cigar smoking, drinking party guy and put it in his brain that he wasn't worth anything if he wasn't that guy. And he's like, and you look at now, like we do celebrate when people are able to break out of that role, even to the extent of I was talking about like Melissa McCarthy. You know what I mean? Like she's stepped away from being like the pratfall girl and is actually doing these amazing dramatic roles and stuff because like that alone, being the person who has to fall down a flight of stairs constantly is like not good for your body.
I can back that statement up as a former stuntwoman.
Yeah, but yeah, I wanted to tell more people about the story of Doug Kinney because I've been a huge comedy fan and really until that Netflix movie, I didn't know who he was. And then the more that I researched
I didn't know who he was.
Yeah, the more I researched him, the more I'm like, God, this dude is probably one of the most iconic and important people in comedy. And I'm a huge comedy lover and I didn't know who he was. You know what I mean? So
yeah, that is a shame that it's like the things that he did in his career changed what we know as comedy. Like you said, it's like this radio show basically was like the previs of SNL and Animal House, again, like you said, completely changed the path and trajectory of comedic films and what we know today. It is. Let's get his name out there.
Yeah.
I'm alright. Nobody but about me. Why you got to give me a fight? Can't you just let it be? I'm alright. Don't nobody but
So Gelsey, obviously throughout that recording, we were talking about Doug Kinney, someone who I think is a greatly underappreciated comedic genius who, I think to this day, tragically is still not well known. I'm curious, is there anyone that you can think of that you feel like does not get nearly the amount of mainstream exposure for how important they've been to not just film, but any thing, dance or music or comedy or anything?
I know I have like so many. That's such a good question. I'd have to think about that, to be real honest. Because I feel like I always constantly hear myself being like, God, that person's so underrated and they need more recognition. And now my mind's just going blank.
It happens. I know that my dad used to say a thing, and I've heard this from a few other places too, but like, it never really pays to be the first person to do something.
I 100% agree with that. You don't want to win American Idol. Unless you're Kelly Clarkson or what was her name? Carrie Underwood. They're like the exceptions. You don't want to win American Idol because you don't know any of them. But the people that have huge careers were like third runner up, fifth runner up. Like, yeah,
exactly.
Same in life.
Well, and I even think of,
first.
Like technically Nirvana was basically just doing what, say, Mudhoney or Mother Love Bone was doing before them. But like, unless you're really into 90s grunge music, you don't really know who Mudhoney or Mother Love Bone is.
I do not know who they are.
Definitely know who Nirvana is because they, you get the advantage of seeing someone try something differently, but then being like, yeah, but if you mix that with a little bit of what's already popular, you can create a completely unique sound. I guess it sucks to say it like this, but it doesn't pay to be unique sometimes.
Because someone will take your idea. Yeah, someone will take your idea. They're like, that's a great idea, but what if we did it this way? Like you just said, and it's so true. It's kind of, I don't have exact names right now, unfortunately, but I do want to do an episode on jump blues, and it's the genre right before rock and roll was birthed. And a lot of those artists and songs, I mean, like Hound Dog, which we know from Elvis Presley, he is not the first person to do Hound Dog. There's an older recording. And so it's like all these amazing hit songs got written and created and performed, but then someone comes along and you see that all the time in music.
Yeah.
And so I think there's just so many musicians that could be listed in this category that I think a lot we don't even know who they are, unfortunately.
Yeah, you bringing up jump blues. I didn't even, makes me think of, you ever listen to skiffle? You know what skiffle is? Okay,
No.
so skiffle, I remember this from my American music class, but it was like very garagey. It was like they're from low incomes, they can't afford instruments. So it was like literally like instead of a bass, skiffle bands were like a bathtub, a wash tub.
Like a washboard.
Yeah, like a wash tub with a hole in it with a big stick and some strings on it for them to slap. But it was like that. Their drums were like at most like a snare and then like a guy who had like a very cheap guitar, but they would do their best to do rock and roll. And it was this completely unique sound. But like you listen
really
to
cool.
skiffle and you hear like what would become like the sound of the Beatles almost. Like it's like very like that just like scrappy, simplistic, fast rock music.
Fun. I got to listen to that.
Before you listen to that skiffle song, where can people go to check out and maybe send us other skiffle songs?
Please send us your skiffle songs. You can come check us out on the gram of Insta. Our handle is at beforemytime_podcast. You can also find us on Facebook. Just search Before My Time. That's right. That picture is my mug. That'll show up. Join us there. Send some skiffle songs there. Send us some favorite videos and images from things that you love before your time or that you just think, this is crazy. Let me share it with a community of people who love this shit. Please, if you would love to, give us a 5-star review. It helps us out. It makes me love you more. I already love you. You know that. But it would be grand.
And we'll be back next week with more Before My Time.
Yeah.
Hey, do you have an idea for a podcast but don't know where to start? Or do you have an already existing podcast that you want to take to the next level? Well, check out WeKnowPodcasting.com. From concept development to theme music to editing to logos, WeKnowPodcasting.com is a one-stop shop for all things pod. Don't hesitate to hit us up. We're very nice.
You're listening to the Geekscape Network. You're listening to the Geekscape Network.